welcome. Please take a seat for the final people coming in. I would like to welcome you for the afternoon plenary session, but I will not be chairing it, but I have a few household announcements to make. And the first one is that I would like to remind you of the 2 QR codes. One next to the posters for the visual display of the poster, the best poster. And then if you go to the presentation in the parallel session of the visual presentations, then there's also a QR code for the best visual presentation in that parallel session. And I would like to invite you to vote for the best two possibilities, so to say. Then there is another QR code, but also a link that will be sent to you today, this afternoon, about the evaluation of the conference. So please be so kind to fill it in, because we can use it and improve for the next time. And then I have a third announcement. It's regarding the dinner. So the dinner is limited to the people who have paid for the dinner. Unfortunately, we could not make it available for everyone. So if you have paid for the dinner, it's indicated on your beds with dinner. And it's only a 10-minute walk, so we invite you to be there at 7 tonight. So yeah, I hand over to Sarah Davies, who will chair the session.
So thank you, Anna. And welcome to everybody to this plenary session. As you can see, or you perhaps could see before, the theme for the afternoon is How Disagreements Matter in Creating Common Ground, Reflections from Science Communication Theory and Research. We are, as you may also see in a minute, rather a professor-heavy panel in the afternoon, but what I hope is that we can exactly discuss insights, ideas from theory and research in science communication, and how that intersects with lived experience and practice within the domain of public communication of science. The structure that we have, we start with a 20-minute talk by Professor Ulrike Felt. We will then move, invite the panelists to come up into this nice daytime talk show format up here, and have some brief comments from 3 panelists, and then a discussion between them, but also, I hope, between you. And we will finish, I hope, at 3:10 at the latest, to give you time to get to the next sessions. Professor Felt, who will start us in giving a short talk, she will be familiar to many people here, I think, both personally and through her work. Since 1999, she is Professor of Science and Technology Studies at the University of Vienna. She is head of the Department of Science and Technology Studies, and she has recently been awarded an ERC Advanced Grant, so a grant from the European Research Council, which gives you an idea, I think, of how esteemed she is in the community and how innovative and important her research is. She is author of numerous texts that are key to science communication. Again, they will be familiar to many of you, including a recent book, Which Science for Which Society? That is my translation from the German. You can correct it when you come up. Ulrike, please take the floor.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks for the organizers to give me this chance to speak to you this afternoon, and thanks for showing up, so many of you. In the next 20 minutes, I want to offer you a specific take on the topic of creating common grounds, which is at the core of this year's PCST conference. Over the past 2 days, the notion of values has popped up quite frequently in conversations, and I take this as my starting point and reflect not so much on the values per se, and how they matter, but much more on the practices, how we value something. And I put that center stage. My argument in a nutshell, a good understanding of the diverse forms of valuing by diverse actors is key in creating common grounds. In doing so, I will, as my title already gives away, focus on moments of disagreement around issues of science and technology, and use them as a lens to study valuation. In doing so, I draw on a couple of decades of research into questions of communication and engagement around science and technology from a science and technology studies perspective. What I observed in the last decade or more is a growing proliferation of guidebooks, courses for scientists, best practice collections, organized exchanges with experienced science communicators, or science communication is being cast in a number of conferences as alternative career models for researchers. Well, this is obviously nothing to be said against. However, it is important to consider that it is taking place at the backdrop of rising pressures on scientists and scientific institutions to do more to improve the relation of techno-scientific and societal developments. There is a feeling of urgency at the center of this push, a clear call to better align the social and the techno-scientific developments. This is clearly perceptible in the European science and technology policy discourse, or actually by now I should call it the innovation policy discourse, and it was very interesting for me to see that innovation as a notion just very little appeared in the discussion here, which is in the policy discourse the notion to speak about science and technology, which is kind of interesting to reflect maybe on. The fear is omnipresent that people might not be sufficiently supportive to and embrace scientific technological innovations. The terminology of creating an innovation-friendly climate used in European Commission speak is an indicator. The most recent example was the pandemic, where all of a sudden political decisions became closely entangled with scientific insights, often also called facts, turning political choices into epistemological questions, and through this move, to a certain degree, limiting policymakers and our citizens' alternatives. Taking into consideration the deep uncertainty that was related to the scientific insights into the pandemic dynamic, this produced both a heightened attention to science, which was greeted by many, but also a new fragility as the science that moved center stage had little to do with the rather idealized images that had been sold in the public arena for decades. Policymakers wanted hard numbers, to quote, to justify their political measures. Also in the public imagination and cultivated over many decades, numbers were perceived as a mark of precision and stability. But we all had to learn the hard way that numbers do not simply describe reality, but they make reality. They are surrogates for or simulations of what scientists believe is happening or will be happening. The discourse of improving the relation between technoscience and societal developments is and always was thus full of tensions and contradictions, which this cartoon, in my view, nicely brings to the point. I expect you all to be independent, innovative, and critical thinkers who will do exactly what I tell you. So, my focus on valuing invites to explore together a number of questions. How do different societal actors experience socially, rationally, and effectively science, and how does science communication matter in these experiential contexts? At this backdrop, we also have to ask, how do societal actors then value and evaluate science, and how do they integrate information, knowledge, insights, however you want to call them, into their respective worlds of relevance? I specifically am not using the notion of identity here, which was also kind of popping up here and then, because it would suggest that there's a rather stable position from which people, we, speak from and relate to science. The notion of worlds of relevance does two things for me for this talk. First, the plural points to the fact that people never just inhabit one world of relevance that matters, but this might change depending on the issues to be addressed and the values at stake. The broader cultural context might matter, national, local traditions. Okay. Secondly, relevance. The notion opens up the fact that people do not relate to science in general, but in clearly situated ways to a particular kind of science and technology. More to that in a minute. Finally, if we are interested in reflecting on the creation of common ground, it seems, to my view, essential to ask how a good understanding of practices of valuing might help us in doing so. By now, 30 years ago, the British STS researcher Brian Wynne, when studying how sheep farmers encountered experts after the Chernobyl disaster, wrote the following couple of sentences, and I would like to use them as a trigger. People experience scientific information in terms of social relations, interactions, and interests, and I would personally add, with all the affective dimensions involved in other three, and thus they do not form judgments about scientific knowledge in isolation from other social concerns. Instead, they judge scientific knowledge as an integral part of the social contract that involves mutual expectations and obligations. So I want to take this as a starting point and unpack it through reflecting the way people value, so make value judgments about both scientific and technological developments. In doing so, I argue we can profit from what we learned from decades of research into controversies in and around science and technology. Therefore, in order to better understand the values at work, both in making science and technology, in communicating both, and in the uptake and integration of both into our lives, it is key to stop regarding disagreements as a problem of the people, a failure of effectiveness in doing science communication, but as a perfect moment where mutual understandings can take shape, forming the starting point for any kind of common ground. Why disagreement? First, writing dis in parentheses invites looking at both how disagreement emerges, on which grounds, justified and argued how, and by whom, and this will be my focus, as well as where, when, and how agreement is then reached, or at least temporarily stabilized. The latter also needs questioning, namely, is agreement an end in itself? What do we lose if agreement and closure is reached too quickly? While I will not touch so much on the agreement part, I can recommend interesting reflections by Maya Horst and Alan Irvin on what they call consensuing. So the active process of seeking and expecting societal consensus. They point also to what can be lost when the consensus ideal is employed as a means of closing down complexity and reducing social opposition. So back to the disagreement. Actually, disagreement is quite common and productive phenomenon in science, but also in the public arenas concerning technoscientific issues. Such frictions can come in many different forms, as challenges, contradictions, open or hidden conflicts, larger or smaller controversies, so they play out very differently. From a science and technology studies perspective, we can learn that disagreements in all forms open up the black box of science and technology, but also, and that's my argument, of how science in all its diversity is perceived in different public arenas and by different actors. So looking at disagreement then gives us a privileged access to often implicit values and value orders, to valuing practices, to emotions, memories of the past, imaginations about the future, and many more. At the end, we are all stakeholders, have agendas, hold specific positions, are rich assemblages of experiences on whatever side we are speaking from. This moves us away from asking whether or not science communication has been convincing people or has been effective in positioning scientific knowledge or any technological option as the reasonable choice, expecting a more or less unconditional trust in science. The cultural anthropologist Anat Singh teaches us that frictions are part and parcel of any encounters, interactions, and interconnections. In our case, between research and researchers or different societal actors, but also within the scientific communities or within diverse societal arenas. There is no movement, she highlights, no development, no advancement without frictions. And she gives this very nice metaphor of saying, if the tire doesn't hit the road, you won't advance. So, and I think this is a very powerful vision that frictions are actually what drives us, what makes us move ahead. Therefore, it is an invitation for the moment to understand and embrace frictions, maybe even to love them for a while, as they are key moments pointing us to the awkward, unequal, unstable, and creative qualities of interconnection across difference. Embracing frictions and unpacking their dynamic allows us for a moment to see and maybe even understand the multiple levels on which knowledge and science are negotiated, with all the valuing involved in doing so. And in the end, it might nourish our science communication. Disagreements are, in my understanding, not so much struggles over who gets the facts right or who has the right facts, but over what counts as a legitimate valuing practice. Inspired by and adapted from work of Weibel and co-authors, I argue that the practice of valuing must be understood in the framework of so-called valuation constellations, which allows me to unpack, actually, and take apart what is happening when citizens want to, or are asked to, take a position towards a technoscientific issue. So when studying valuation as practice, 3 elements are key. First, the position of the valuator, so the person who is expressing values or is valuing. Which roles are available to that person? Where is a person speaking from, or can a person speak from? For example, I'm an affected patient, I'm a professor, I'm a whatsoever, an expert in this or that. How does this give them legitimation to make a value statement or perform an evaluation? How does a specific role give privileged access to a repertoire of justifications, values, and emotions that can be performed? Paying attention to these aspects allows us to see that in one and the same discussion, engagement, conversation, however you want to call it, participants may or may not slip into and temporarily embrace very diverse roles, such as being a taxpayer, a mother with responsibilities, a person self-declared as incapable to assess science, an affected citizen, an experienced lay actor, a person who does not need to care, and many, many more. I've heard all that in the discussions I carried out. It is amazing to observe how along one debate, participants might just simply switch these roles and use them to position themselves in this fight over explanation. And so it is important to not take them as identifying clear-cut positions. And that's why it's so difficult to speak about identity in that sense, because you see all these shifts taking place. Then we have audiences as a second element. And today already there was a session where we heard also about audience, and also yesterday, who is our audience? Do we address the right audience? While these are really relevant questions, I would like to open it up. How do citizens imagine other societal actors to which they imagine to speak, but also for whom they think they are speaking when they are discussing? So do they speak for the taxpayers, for the mothers, for the affected people? So which alliances and misalliances do they imagine when making value statements? And in that sense, statement people make can never be seen as a standalone utterance, but as part of a web of other imagined and real actors that are in the room and beyond the room. Finally, what is exactly being valued or evaluated? So what is the valuee? I would like to connect this to the first plenary session with the filmmaker and the vaccination issue that was addressed. It was always implicitly assumed that the decision of people was about vaccine and its security, the consequences of taking or not taking it, risk assessment, responsibility via others. But maybe people also evaluate very different aspects, such as trust in the healthcare system I'm part of, or in the state, more widely speaking, or maybe imagine that they always want to have choices and they don't want to be obliged to do something. Or, and you could go on, or maybe it's their personal medical experience they had, and more. So it's key to consider how participants reframe the issue at stake. Now, this triangle, valuator, audience, valuee, is then embedded in an environment of rules and infrastructures available to people when valuing. So, what does that mean in practice? Rules of valuation actually are often non-codified norms that give orientation to how we can express values and emotions in any given settings. From my research, I know that people express very different kinds of values and emotions when they come to a university seminar room for a debate, when they meet in a coffee house, discuss over a beer, have a one-on-one conversation, and so on. Such spaces are perceived, felt, understood, and imagined in very specific ways. And valuing is defined by these spaces in which they take place and the tacit rules that govern these spaces. For example, specific emotional expressions are described as displaced when done in a university setting. I hear sentences like, "We're discussing here in a respectful way," or saying, "Such an argument should not be considered here." The "here" is the interesting part in that sentence. So what are they allowed to do? At the same time, we speak of valuation infrastructures, and these are the things that facilitate, transform, stabilize, but also allow to distribute valuations. Coming from a university, we all know the valuation infrastructures universities have. They count your publications, they count the money you get for your research, and they use that to evaluate you and to express your value for the institution. In a similar way, also citizens have value infrastructures and use them in specific ways. For example, do they have narratives available to talk from that people recognize? Can they simply tap into that, etc.? Or we could use Brian Wynn's institutional body language. So the way institutions are perceived in a specific community, can they be used as a resource? So if I speak from a university position, does that give me more power than if I say I'm one of the corporate actors, the bad corporate actors, by the way? And for example, or do I come from China? That is also generally, lay people would always think data can go everywhere but to China, which is, for me, a very interesting observation. For example, people would say, but expert from this or that institution would always make that argument, and it was never true. So that would totally delegitimize the argument, whether it's true or not true, or a right statement or not. So what looking through the lens of valuation constellations allows us is not to speak about values as such, but about valuing and how that goes on and how that has a shifting nature and depends on the context. Now allow me to add a further level of complexity. Valuation practices are always specific to what I call an issue space. What is that? Actually, over the past days, we have been often discussing what becomes an issue. So an identified problem which demands engagement, like climate change, vaccination, etc. In STS, issue formation is seen as essential when thinking about how democratic societies relate to techno-scientific developments. The way issues get spelled out opens up a space in which valuing can take place, in which I can express my values. So issue spaces are never created ad hoc. They always have roots in wider debates and experiences in past and present. They are nourished by and constituted from different pre-existing experiences, material arrangements that are already pre-existing, and narratives are very important in that sense. And so in my research, I identified these three clusters that are always important. Some cluster referring to nature body, some cluster referring to science and technology, and a third one to sociocultural references. Now, let me give you an example from my research before I conclude. This is from a citizen debate about gene editing with CRISPR-Cas9, in particular with regard to gene therapies. This is a graphic representation which I will build up. It comes from this analysis of the citizen group. They were taking place in the beginning of the debate, so it was not on for many years. It starts from the three clusters: nature, body, techno-scientific, and sociocultural. And in the cluster that relates to nature in our body, they frequently refer as a starting point to this ideal vision of nature in our bodies. They are pure but imperfect. And we can live with that, and there's a lot of discourse around the naturality of us and our bodies, etc. So when you then go to the techno-scientific one, so there is a lot of the ambivalent narratives about the promises of improvement and the perceived pressure to follow techno-optimization logic. And finally, when it comes to social-cultural discourses, at the moment when these debates took place, there was nothing. And people had a difficult time to find how to speak about it, because there was nothing very little in the media, not in the media that most people read, and that was very difficult for them to have a resource how to speak about gene editing. So this leads to a number of tensions which became central to that engagement. First, we can observe a clash between valuing related to the body and valuing related to technoscientific. So the question of what needs repair or improvement, and who defines that limit, and what space should be given to rather promissory narratives that technoscience will do the trick of improving everything. While some start from the idea that imperfection is a natural state and should stay like that, others quite heavily argue that we always have in our history been following the idea of improvement. But we also see attention to the question that broader sociocultural values should play here. So who should or should not define these limits, and how and based on which valuing should we draw the boundary between normality and perfection? As they cannot tap into any available public discourse, we observe them taking wild analogies and rather unspecific comparisons, struggling to find common ground they would be able to refer to. The second hot debate, then very shortly touched on, emerges at the intersection of technoscientific and sociocultural reference frames. Here, the tap into the commonly available story of trajectorial narrative of society towards improvement through science and technology. This is then, by some of them, juxtaposed by a slippery slope argument that, I quote, "From the past we know that the outcomes of implementing science and technology never live up to the promises, and things always don't go the way that we are told. This allows them to address issues, for example, of a two-class medicine, so even if that might help some, it will definitely not help them. Or eugenics crops up whenever these things are discussed. And this brings me to identifying another interesting tension. Building on the available technoscientific discourse, some participants simply refer to, "I don't know, the state should take care of that." While others come up and say, no, we have these values of nature and body, and actually that's why we should talk about inequalities, question of distributive justice. They want to point to the complex relation between imposing something for everybody and leaving individual choices. So you see there's also a clash on this societal level. So this takes me to my concluding, This takes me to my concluding slides. So what can we take away from what I just outlined? To create common ground, so my argument demands a thorough understanding of disagreements and the intensive valuing embedded in it. Doing science communication, engagement, debates needs actually this understanding of how valuation constellations work and how one can supports those who have access to less resources in developing a position. So this is an unequal relationship here in these debates about where they take the resources from. This would call for attention to the specificity also of the issues, the spaces in which a debate takes place, and the legitimate registers of valuation that are therefore available to them. And finally, this would mean to move away from thinking in terms of science communication as straightforward support for societal embracement of science and technology, from measuring effective communication along support for science and technology, but actually see PCSTs in the role of creating resources for engagement, thus creating space for careful and response-able disagreements, potentially contributing to trust and in the end to more stable forms of agreements. Thank you.
So, yeah, thank you, Uli, for that incredibly rich presentation. As a reward, you can choose which seat you would like to take on the stage.
And then is there a button which you can press? I mean, there are maybe not enough chairs. Is that a travel to Jerusalem?
I will stand up. Yeah, as you sit, I will introduce our discussants, and you can come on down as I call your names. So, yeah, Professor John Besley, you've already stood up, so I'm going to introduce you. John is Ellis N. Brandt Professor of Public Relations at Michigan State University. Again, I think his work will be familiar to many people here. Dr. Mamoletsi Mosia is the Managing Director of the South African Agency for Science and Technology Advancement. She has a background in chemistry a PhD in polymer chemistry, but has also spent a lot of time at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. And finally, Professor Bernard Schieler is a professor of communication at the Faculty of Communication at the University of Quebec in Montreal, Canada. He is a founding member of PCST, so I guess, again, will be familiar to many people. So please welcome our discussants. So what I would invite each of you to do is just to offer a few brief reflections and thoughts on the presentation and on what you'd prepared previously. Please, I would be so grateful if you didn't speak for more than 5 minutes, and I guess I will intervene if that happens. Mama Letzi, perhaps you would be so kind as to go first.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm not a professor, so I will be talking from my own experience and not necessarily from the research that I've done. You spoke about societal actors, and the bulk of your talk was in terms of agreements or disagreements, and therefore that means that there is a debate of sort or a conversation of sort. I come from a country where we have 11 official languages. 9 of those languages are not very advanced in terms of scientific concepts. Now, how do we then have a conversation when I cannot describe crystallization in isiZulu or in isiXhosa or in isiVenda, Chivenda, which is some of the very immature languages. On top of the 11 official languages, we have so many other languages because we have people from other countries who are also in our country. Now, I actually wanted to say we're very fortunate to have this discussion after the COVID war, as we had in the morning. And the COVID war actually exposed science and the need for science communication. Now, we then need to communicate the science. How do we communicate it in one of the lesser advanced languages? You're talking about a vaccine, and when a grandmother takes a child to be vaccinated, they never asked questions. It was very funny when people started debating about vaccines that when we were vaccinating children, nobody asks questions. But now that it is us adults who then need to be vaccinated, we are asking questions and we are all now scientists. But now you need to have this conversation in a language that has never spoken of a vaccine in that language. How do you do that? That's the one part of the challenge that I, as a science communicator in my country, is faced with. The second one is the literacy levels. In our country, you have a very high majority of our adult population who are illiterate. And you find that some of them are grandmothers who are taking care of the younger children because the parents have died. How do you then communicate this science, this new innovation that's very good for a child, with this old person who does not understand? And the last one, as a scientist, we always thought that we are better than the other scientists. The natural scientists, we are the intelligent ones, we are better than the others. But I've since grown and matured to realize that we actually do ourselves a disservice when we do not involve the other. In the vaccine conversation, if you involve a social scientist who understands the community better, the conversation will be different. But no, we want to go alone because it is our technology. We know better, yet we are unable to engage with the society. Given all these 3 challenges or these 3 issues, how then do we even get to a point where we have a debate and we can have agreement or disagreement?
Thank you. Bernard.
Oh, it's working, thank you. So I really appreciated the talk we just heard from Ulrike. We've known each other for a very long time. No, okay, no, I won't mention. I'm sorry. Okay, I'll stop right now. Okay, no problem. So I really appreciated the talk because she, in her way, in her own discourse, she reminded us that science and technology are more than closely related. There is nothing like science on one side and society on the other side. Both are not only closely related to each other, but are an integrated part of each other. Science is not outside society, and society is not beside science. They are both closely related. And in such an order that even if we don't know about science, even if we do not personally relate to science, we are nevertheless modeled by science. Because science is nowadays the very fabric of our modern society. We are, whether or not we like it, part and contributor to this ongoing process that define our modernity. Of course, along the way, it might intersect with value, with norms, with power, with resources, and it can't be otherwise. Because either scientists or the scientific community are also part of that huge community we are all involved in and part of. So in that sense, we don't have to provoke disagreement. There will be always disagreement, and it can't be otherwise. Because there are so many value, norms, power relations, resources at stake, that there will be conflict. And as science is the dominant value and the dominant factors modeling our own society, most of the conflict and the disagreement will arise with our relation with science. Whether we are educated or not, whether we are, let's say, modeled by indigenous knowledge, we will be confronting or confronted by science at any moment in our own existence, in any society, anywhere in the world. So, disagreement is not something we will decide to provoke, or something we will decide to exploit, or something that could be useful in the way to adjust our understanding of our relation to science. They will pop up constantly in our modern society, and there is no way we can escape it. And this is why I think the talk of Uli was extremely interesting, because in her own way, she reminded us that somewhat, I would say, terrifying reality. So the conflict we experienced during the pandemic were not something of the extraordinary. It was simply the result of the very complex relation our society is developing with science, because science is an integral part of ourself, our modernity, and the way we live. There is no other possibility, whether or not we like it.
Thank you. John, last but not least.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to share. And so I'm coming at this from the perspective of a social scientist, but also a social scientist who's particularly interested in strategy. And my goals are to help the scientific community, scientists, science communicators, make convincing arguments to other people. in a sense that I think there's something valuable in trying to put out an argument with the hope that people agree with you, but with the expectation, but also the hope that somebody else is going to come along and disagree with you in a way that, oh, you know what? So this is the thing. So I want to help scientists be better communicators by helping them, for me, I say set goals, make strategies, but then at the same time, part of the strategy, part of the goal is to like, oh, that person disagrees with me, and then not to say, well, they're wrong. I mean, clearly, let's push forward, bulldoze forward, but let's stop, think, be reflexive, change how, like, yeah, that goal is a tentative initial goal. How about this goal? And how about this argument? And how about, and so then we sort of, we can push forward using, and so we're not seeking out disagreements, but we are expecting them and eager for them, and how do we get into them in a way that we use, but it's an opportunity to figure something out. Now it's possible you were right, but you're also not going to convince everybody, and you have to accept that. And sometimes you're going to convince enough people, or sometimes you're going to have to find a middle ground. But absolutely, there's something about. I mean, for me, this is one of the hardest things about writing about strategy and writing about, selecting goals and figuring out objectives and tactics to achieve that is also getting the scientists to recognize that you have to have a goal of being willing to stop, go back, start over, maybe not start over, maybe back to the middle. And the other side of that is we also need an infrastructure, a structure, a place, so that the people we're interacting with have somebody to help them make their best arguments, so that we're getting the best thing that if we're out there consulting, getting advice, trying to test our ideas, that we have to recognize that I think, of course, sometimes the people we're interacting with, because of power, because of historical situation, that they don't have the opportunity, necessarily the resources at that time to put, maybe at the start, to put their best argument forward. But we could then also, as a community, how do we make sure we help them? Because we want those best arguments. We need those best arguments if we're going to move forward. So I think I agree with you. I think, but I take it from like this very strategic point, but I always do worry about, it doesn't feel right sometimes to try to be convincing people, but is there a version of trying to convince people that's okay? That's part of the process of moving forward, if we can do it reflexively, responsibly, carefully.
Thanks, John. So we have about 10 minutes, and we would invite comments and questions from the floor on these kind of themes of disagreement, themes and experiences of disagreements, the challenges of finding a shared language, the fruitfulness of looking at how people value things. We have the mics in kind of the middle, so I would just invite you, if you have a question or comment, to kind of line up in an orderly fashion behind them, and I will call on you. As you do that, though, Uli, I can see by the way that you are twitching that you already have some ideas and reflections. So maybe a couple of brief thoughts as people come down.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I particularly want to address the language question, because I think you made a very strong point about saying, so do we have a shared language to start with to address that? But for me, from my empirical research, the fascinating thing is you have people who seemingly share the language, and they still do not share the language. So there is, within highly educated countries that have one language, one education system whatsoever, you sitting at the table and you realize that there are very different capacities to speak about the relation of science, technology, and society. Because people live that very differently, perceive it very differently, and have different resources. And what I was meaning is actually, can we develop ways to give people the resource to speak it? And in that sense, you pointed to a really very strong point that makes that even more visible. That you say, okay, this science is not even part of the language in a way, and I still have to explain it. But a lot of people also have that in so-called highly educated, standardized, normalized country where you might imagine that it works like that. But once you're in the middle of these debates, you realize that it does not work so easily and that there are huge inequalities in expressing their vision. And that often ends up in very reaction, in this kind of, no, I don't want to. Because it's also the incapacity to articulate the why and the how, etc. So in that sense, and Bernard, you're right to say, yes, science and technology, it's part of. The question is like, do people perceive it like that? The question is not, is it like that? And for me, the interesting thing is like, how do actually people tell the story about the society they want to be part of? And I'm always struck about this nature and body language that people use and say, one shouldn't intervene in our bodies, and then you look at the person, you think, okay, she has contact lenses and she has kind of teeth fillings and she has some help here and some help there. And it's fascinating that this is still a story that holds, and I'm interested in these kinds of things. So why do myths about the purity and imperfection of nature are still so important in a society where we have gone over hundreds of years into transforming that into a highly technological environment? I agree with you totally on that. And then what I think is actually, there are so many cultural differences in the way we value and we can express values that I think it is important to think about these kind of micro differences. Because of course on the larger level, this might not be so visible and so clearly, and I must confess that for sure I know scientists who would kind of engage with people and start to rethink theirs. I know probably the majority who wouldn't. So in the sense of saying, come on, I don't want to kind of convince these people if they don't want to listen to me, So there is also this pragmatic position that it's under time pressure, it's, like, this space of engagement is not so open as we might think. That's my experience, at least.
Thanks, Uli. So in the interest of time, we have at least 4 questions. Hello. I would suggest we take 1, 2, 3, 4 all together, and then the whole panel has, a minute or so to answer all of those. So you, sir, first.
Thanks, yeah. So we've talked about how SDS can enable SciComm not just to be an unquestioned advocate for science, but how can SciComm also help SDS, critical health studies, ethics, actually move from just conceptualizing things to actually taking concrete action? So how do we make all these arguments, which we find in journals that usually not most people have access to, visible in the public sphere, but also in political debates and influence actual policy? Thanks.
Thanks.
So my question is related to, we talked about the values and the disagreements, but mostly from the individual's perspective, but we actually work within organizations, institutions, and we're limited by how either our institution or our fundings allow us to do and their own values and goals. So how do we talk about these disagreements when it comes to the higher position of the institutions and organizations?
Thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you. I feel that disagreements often hinge at a clash of paradigms, and I'm very curious what you all feel is the role of real listening and understanding the position behind that, and maybe if science communicators and scientists need better training in that.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So my question is about science communication and how you do empowerment with science communication, because what I really liked about your talk is that it really kind of puts the magnifying glass on the power dynamics of the world of science itself. And I think earlier criticisms about science communication is that it assumes that people are lacking, like either knowledge or trust or something. But I think now with your perspective, we can add another layer to that, which is that we assume that publics lack agency. And from this perspective, I was wondering, how can we then do science communication if we kind of assume that publics might have agency to interpret it in their own way and act upon it in their own way? And how are we vulnerable? Like, how do we do science communication without it turning into a savior complex?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Thank you for all of the questions, each of which I think deserves another hour to discuss. You actually have slightly less than a minute each if we had to finish on time. So I'm sorry to force you into this position, but I guess I would just ask for a few brief reflections going round. Perhaps nobody wants to start.
You want to start? Yes, of course.
No, we do it in order. Bernard?
So I agree always with Ulrike. Disagreement is something that is positive. It is not something that is abnormal. It's something that will happen. And we have to live, I think, following your talk, we have to accept that disagreement is a normal part of life, because it will reveal what's behind the norm, the value, the power relation, the resources, all those elements that were mentioned by, I would say, that person over there. And this, in that sense, is extremely positive, because it reveals us what are the differences that are very often, I would say, dissimulated from the side of the people that are interacting, and that could lead to some, I would say, adjustment, to a very positive reaction to restore the balance of power, of value, and so on. I stop immediately.
Thanks.
Thank you. You have to finish the sentence, you know, that's the name of the game.
I'm lost. I will start my own sentence. But on the same note, you touched on listening and understanding. Oftentimes when there are disagreements, the reason behind might be because I did not listen. When one started talking, I already had an answer to whatever it is that the person was saying. And I must say that as scientists, because we think we know it all, we often just answer based on what it is that I believe, and we don't get to listen and understand what the other person wants to say or the view of the other person, because, hey, I've spent 5 years in the lab researching this thing, so you can't tell me otherwise. But maybe it's a reflection on us as scientists to learn to listen, to understand, and to engage as we are communicating our science to the community.
Yes, and so so one of the things I think we should think about as science communicators, I really love the literature on procedural justice, procedural fairness, and so for me, that's where I come at the listening question of we need to design processes that not just to help scientists be better at listening, but we need to design processes and infrastructure and that enable us to listen in meaningful ways and going to that can reshape our organizations. One of the things you can do in an organizational context is that may mean that the first goals are in changing the organization, changing structures in the organization, that conversation. But I mean, I don't think anyone's going to argue against listening, but it's not just at the individual scientist, it's the structures and processes that enable us to listen.
Thanks. And Uli, you get the last word.
Oh, wow. Okay. I think all 4 questions actually would deserve a bit more discussion, but what I find personally very, very important to think about is not to just look at the contents of the argument, but really look about what are the values that are below these arguments, and where do they come from, and what do they express actually. And that very often does not happen. They listen in the sense of what people say, but they do not ask themselves, where does that come from? What kind of concern is expressed through a certain position? That is very rarely happen, I must say. And I think we need to get there in a sense of, you spoke about empowerment, to think about, so how can we claim space for different visions of things? And actually values are involved in science, they're involved, as I said, in communication, they're involved everywhere. So let's just take that seriously and do both. Look at what they argue, but also on what grounds do they argue that, and why are they so attached to certain positions. And then you might get closer to an argumentative space that you can open up. And I think this is really important as analysts and also as thing. And policy-wise, I'm sorry, yes, we would agree that disagreement is good. If I speak to policy, no. They don't want disagreement. They want that people say yes. So it's very difficult to bring certain things into the policy arena because all they want to know at the end of the day, will at the end be agreement and how fast will it be? That is the questions that I get asked then. And of course, that's the end of the argument then, because of then I get into talk them into something. And that's something I don't feel like I want to engage in, to be honest. So, and that's also where a lot of the money goes, to be honest. Yeah.
So thank you, Ulrike. Yeah, thank you, everybody. I feel pain at having to cut off this discussion because I think it's so rich. But I want to allow people time to get to the next session. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and for you for participating and being here.